My name is Daniera Coleman, and this is Jack Brown, and together we'll be performing Caro Nome from Verdi's Rigoletto. And thank you so much for having us. We hope you enjoy.
Greetings to everybody. Happy Human Rights Day. Thank you to our young international opera singer, Daniera Coleman, for her performance of Gilda's aria from Rigoletto. I apologize that the video came on late and the sound was not of good quality, but many thanks to her for doing this for us and for honoring Justice Ginsburg with this passion of her life. On behalf of UN Women and our partners, Harvard Law School Center, Stanford Law School Center, and University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our event, Equal in Law and Life, a tribute to Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We are holding this event as part of our Leaders for Generation Equality campaign on this International Human Rights Day. My name is Lopa Banerjee, and I'm the Director of the Civil Society Division at UN Women, and I'm honored to be the MC for this event. Our event will be divided into two conversation circles. The first one, Equality in Public Life, the role of women leaders in transforming law and life. And that will be moderated by Rangita de Silva de Alves, who is the Associate Dean of International Affairs at the University of Pennsylvania Law School and also leader in residence at the Harvard Kennedy School. And our second discussion circle, Equality in the Law, how feminist interpretations of the law can promote equality in public and private spheres, will be moderated by Clara Spera, who is also a lawyer and an ACLU legal fellow. And on this day, it's particularly poignant to note that she's also the granddaughter of Justice Ginsburg. We encourage all speakers and audiences and partners to amplify whatever you hear, whatever you like from this conversation. Please use the hashtags Generation Equality and hashtag Human Rights Day. And we also encourage all participants to chat in your questions at the bottom of your screen. And without further ado, let me turn the floor over to Rangita to start the first conversation circle. Over to you, Rangita. Rangita, you're on mute.
She has to. Happy Human Rights Day. Thank you, Lopa, for your leadership, and thank you for the music. Justice Ginsburg always wanted to be a diva in the world of opera. She will always be the world's diva on women's rights. In what the Justice has declared to be the most beautiful court building in the world, the Constitution Court of South Africa, she has said, I place value on dialogue, on sharing with and learning from others. This tribute today on Human Rights Day pays homage to her fundamental philosophy on sharing with and learning from others. And as we go on to look at the most important facets of her jurisprudence, she has said that the world has much to learn from the courts of Canada and South Africa. And that is why today we have justices from both courts to celebrate her global legacy. I start now with Justice Abela, the longest serving justice of the Canadian Supreme Court. Justice Ginsburg once said of this legendary jurist, I am so proud to count her among my dearest sisters-in-law. Justice Rosalia Abela, in your recent eulogy for Justice Ginsburg, you evoke this particular moment of global reckoning, what the Secretary General has called our own 1945 moment. You wrote in your eulogy, as human rights are being rolled back or cavalierly politicized in so many parts of the world, a world where the vulnerable has become more vulnerable, where prejudice poisons, hate kills, truth is homeless, and lives don't matter. Is it any wonder that Justice Ginsburg's legacy is so preternaturally cherished as a rebuke to all of the above? She is a reminder that democracy does not just depend on the will of the people, but on their humanity. Those were your words, Justice Abela, and as we rededicate ourselves to her legacy today, these are fundamental truths upheld by jurists and feminists around the world who fight to preserve the rule of law and the democratic values of human dignity. Justice Abela, I would like you to expand on your powerful eulogy for Justice Ginsburg.
Well, first of all, it's a great honor to be here with so many wonderful panelists who've devoted their lives to all of the values that Justice Ginsburg represented. So I think what's important this morning, particularly, is the fact that it's a confluence of three important things that we're marking. One is the legacy of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The second one is that it's International Human Rights Day. But the third one is it's the 75th anniversary this year of the end of World War II. And I think we can't have a discussion on Human Rights Day without understanding why we have Human Rights Day, and that it emerged from the atrocities of the Second World War, which reminded us what the world looks like when there's no democracy and no human rights. So against that background, let me start with Justice Ginsburg. Her role to me was in being a global judicial metaphor for what the role of a judge is. Not to be popular, not to be afraid of controversy, to speak to what the law is in a particular situation, and to understand that for women, the law and justice look different. And in fact, I would say that's her most important legacy, the understanding that equality is not sameness, that equality is understanding difference, gender differences, racial differences, and that in order to have equality, you need to be able to recognize and accommodate those differences. So we are all representatives of the fact that we've been very lucky and that much has been achieved so far in Ruth Bader Ginsburg's lifetime. But we also have to recognize that for probably most women, there is still much to be done. We have childcare and pay equity. They have a disproportionate share of poverty. So as far as we've come, there is still much to do, I think, for women. But let me now go to the more general concern I have, and that is about human rights and democracy and the arc of the moral universe. So in my view, we're at the edge of a future unlike I've ever seen in my lifetime. And it's a future that I see as very divisive, insensitive, and at times very macho. And that makes it very dangerous. So we have to worry, all of us, men, women, all over the world, not just about how the climate's changing the world, but how the moral climate is creating an atmosphere polluted by bombastic anti-intellectualism, sanctimonious incivility, and a moral free-for-all. Everyone's talking, no one is listening. We're rolling back hard-fought human rights for minorities, immigrants, refugees, workers, and women. We're forgetting our compassion, and we're making the vulnerable more vulnerable in a world that was supposed to have learned the horrendous cost of discrimination so that being different would no longer expose someone to danger. We're a world now where too often law and justice are in a dysfunctional relationship, and a world where we have much to fear. Democracy is too fragile in too many parts of the globe, and too many democratic institutions and values are thrown under the bus, and far too often political expediency victimizes truth. So too many rights on Human Rights Day, too many rights abuses are unrecognized, let alone confronted. Too many governments have interfered with the independence of their judges and media. Too many people are strident. Too many people have been killed. Too many people are poor. Too many children are hungry, and too many people have lost hope. We're in a danger of a new status quo where anger triumphs over dignity and indignity triumphs over decency, and where injustice is tolerated and tolerance is not. Too much like the old status quo we fought a world war to fix. And so my concluding remarks for all of us, and especially Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she's a reminder that it's not just what you stand for, it's what you stand up for.
Thank you, Justice. And thank you for reminding us about the moral confluence of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, but also of the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action, which brings together a lot of the rights that Justice Ginsburg stood for. And as you said, in her pursuit to bend the moral arc of justice towards women, minorities, people with disabilities, and also those who are marginalized in every corner of the world, I go now to our distinguished host, Fumseli Mlambo Nguka, the Undersecretary General and the head of UN Women, who was the former Vice President of South Africa. Fumseli, as you know, Justice Ginsburg was an ally of the South African Constitution and of South Africa. Among her hallmark colors, her favorite one was the one from Cape Town. And her love for South Africa was returned 1,000-fold when she fell last year. Her great friend and former Constitution Court Justice Albie Sachs said, in South Africa, the news of her mishap was reported akin to the fall of the Roman Empire. Justice Ginsburg has often quoted the South African Constitution, especially Article 10 on the right to human dignity. You, Fumseli, helped to draft the South African Constitution. Going back to Justice Abela's words on the importance of the confluence of both gender and racial justice, Justice Ginsburg's concurring opinion in Gratter v. Bollinger on affirmative action in 2003, Justice Ginsburg relied on international human rights conventions to support her conclusions, including the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW. She noted that affirmative action programs are permissible, but must be temporary measures limited to the length of time required to achieve de facto equality. Now, de facto equality is also your vision, Fumseli, as the leader of UN Women. Can you discuss more about some of the ways in which this vision on de facto equality, transforming and translating de jure equality in the law into practice, and how that transformational act of gender equality around the world is taking place at this moment in history as you celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform of Action, the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, but at a moment in history when the entire world is facing a moment of reckoning on both gender and racial equality.
Thank you very much, Rangita. Thanks, Lopa. And greetings to my fellow panelists. And I thank you so much for spending Human Rights Day with us at UN Women. Thank you so much to the Columbia Law School and Harvard Law School, as well as your own school, Rangita, for being here. I also want to greet my two friends, Zaid, it's lovely to see you, as well as Justice Kampempe. It's wonderful to see you and everyone who is on this call. We indeed in South Africa have appreciated Justice Ginsburg for many of the things that I suspect Justice Kampempe is going to talk about. But for us at UN Women, one of our responsibility is to help countries to repeal discriminatory laws, to enact laws that enforce gender equality, as well as to amend laws so that we can achieve equality. If you look back from 25 years ago when the Beijing Declaration was adopted, in the interim years, we have had about 144 countries taking action to enact laws to address equality. About 25 countries amending their constitutions. But this is not everything that needs to be done. Those changes have affected about 1 billion women in the world. And yet we still have about 2 billion women who live in jurisdiction where about 75% of their rights are not protected in law. And even those who live in countries where there has been progress, it doesn't mean that those women enjoy their full rights. So what Justice Ginsburg said about achieving the rights de facto is definitely not the case for just a significant number of women. So her reference to affirmative action tells us that we actually have to address what separates the fact that we have a law in statute and you have a lived experience. And there's something in between that sometimes does not connect, does not give all women a real possibility to enjoy the laws that are passed in their countries in order for them to enjoy their rights. We have reached out to a number of institutions, and I'm reaching out to you, seeking skills that can assist us to fast track this initiative of ending discriminatory laws. We work with the African Union, with the Commonwealth, with the Interparliamentary Union, with the Organization of International de la Francophonie, with the General Secretary of Ibero-American, and the range of civil society organizations to address the change of laws. And my request to the friends that we have today is that if they could help us so that this work enjoys a lot of support, even in the schools of law, help us to make sure that all students who study law graduate with a gender lens. We find that when we work with judges, with prosecutors, in many countries that we work in, it is a big struggle for them to have a gender perspective. It is not something that they learn at school in many of the situations, and it would make life so easy if all of them would graduate already having a gender lens, and then we take things from there with them. I have my daughter-in-law who's logged in today, who tells me about her experience of having graduated without having been taught about anything to do with women specifically, and only to find when she started practicing that, my goodness, the rights of women are violated this much. And we hope that you can help us to have more students who graduate fully armed to support gender equality through their practice of law. Thank you.
Thank you, Phumzile. And your powerful call to action is heard around the world, not just among the 4 schools that are represented today, but among all of the law schools around the world, to embrace gender equality as part of the gender justice agenda, as part of the law school agenda, and as part of the conviction and the commitment to producing lawyers who are upholders of both gender and racial justice. As Justice Ginsburg said, and she made sure that her own jurisprudence was without borders. She said in the South African Supreme Court, in the Constitutional Court, that racial discrimination raises doubts as to the intensity of our devotion to the democratic faith. And she was, as you know, ahead of her times. In 1972, in her case book that she wrote, that she co-authored with Irma Hill Kay, she had a chapter on comparative side glance and the UN declarations on gender equality. This was in 1972, 7 years before the CEDAW was drafted in 1979. And on that commitment and on that call to action that you have just made, Phumzile, I turn to Professor David Wilkins, the globally renowned Lester Kissel Professor of Law and the Vice Dean for Global Initiatives on the legal profession at Harvard Law School. Now, you spoke, Phumzile, about the role of law schools and their role in fostering equality. David has written about the Obligation Thesis. The obligation thesis that law schools and other academic institutions owe in addressing racial and gender equality, even when they may not be directly responsible for those historic wrongs. David, you clerked for the great Justice Thurgood Marshall, who brought down racial segregation. Justice Ginsburg has frequently been compared to Thurgood Marshall. both because they both focused on using the law to dismantle segregation of race and sex. And they used the law to open opportunities for the marginalized. So I would like you to speak both on the call to action that was issued by FUMSELI for law schools and other academic institutions to commit to producing lawyers and scholars and leaders who are dedicated to addressing racial and gender equality. But also I want you to speak on the interrelatedness of breaking down barriers to race and sex equality at this moment of public reckoning, and the ways in which Justice Thurgood Marshall's and Justice Ginsburg's intellectual paths crossed. David?
Thank you so much, Rangita, and thank you for having me be a part of such an amazing group of speakers on such an important day. I've had a very blessed life, and a big part of that blessing has been I've actually had the great pleasure of knowing both Justice Marshall and Justice Ginsburg, and seeing, as you say, how their paths have intersected. As you said, I was honored to clerk for Justice Marshall for a year in the United States Supreme Court in the 1981-82 term. But before that, I was blessed to go to law school with Jane Ginsburg. And in fact, not just Jane Ginsburg, but also with George Spira, her husband. And I've also had the privilege of being a part of Harvard Law School when their amazing daughter, Clara, has been there. And just in a small moment of personal thanks, when we were all in DC, Jane invited me to dinner at Justice Ginsburg's home in the Watergate Hotel when her husband, Marty Ginsburg, was still alive. And it was one of the most warm and wonderful dinners. I still think about it very, very fondly. Listen, I think it is very important at this moment to remember the intersection of these two important giants of the legal field around the intersection of race and gender. And as you say, they have in some sense led parallel lives. Justice Ginsburg followed in many ways the kind of step-by-step litigation campaign that Justice Marshall and the great Charles Hamilton Houston pioneered in her campaign for women's equality. And then she argued cases before the United States Supreme Court where Justice Marshall was now a member of that court ruling in favor of gender equality. And then, you know, she ended her career, as Justice Marshall did, writing fiery dissents about the retrenchment of some of the important victories that they had achieved as lawyers and justices in their early career. As I thought about this, I thought that in some ways, no one exemplifies this intersection more than someone else we should remember on this date, and that's the great Pauli Murray. Pauli Murray, we just celebrated the 110th anniversary of Pauli Murray's birth in November. She was born in 1910. And Pauli Murray, as many of you I hope know, was a leading crusader both in the fields of civil rights and gender equality. She fought and argued many cases on the United States, before the United States Supreme Court on racial equality, but she coined the phrase Jane Crow to go along with Jim Crow to exemplify the fact that women were as discriminated as Blacks and other people of color. And in fact, my own law school has a not so illustrious history of that when they admitted Pauli Murray to the graduate program thinking she was a man, only to tell her she could not show up when they realized that she was a woman. And both Justice Marshall and Justice Ginsburg recognized the greatness of Pauli Murray. Justice Marshall famously said that Pauli Murray's 1950 book on race and it was called State Law and Race and Color was, quote, the Bible for civil rights litigation. And when Justice Ginsburg wrote her famous brief in what became the most important gender equality case to date and one of the most important of all time, Reed versus Reed in 1971, she had Pauli Murray as a co-author of that because she felt that Pauli Murray's work had been so important in paving the way for the arguments that she made. It's particularly important that we think about these twin legacies and their intersection today, because one of the things that I think is not focused on enough, but every member of the law school community here will recognize this, is that oftentimes we talk about race in the law school or gender issues in the law school, but as if they're separate things, but we cannot separate them because today, and actually for some period of time, the majority of minority law students are women. And those female law students have every problem that Black and minority law students have, and they have every problem that female law students have, and they have a number of problems at the intersection that make their careers even more challenging, but also make their voices even more important to be heard. So as the great from Zilli just said, this is a moment, and it's a moment for legal education. It's really a moment for the world. If anything good can come out of this terrible year that I'm really quite happy that we're about to say goodbye to, it is that it has shined a spotlight on the structural inequalities and injustices in our world. It is impossible to think about what has happened with the pandemic and the protests around the kind of three intersecting crises we have: a global public health crisis, a looming global economic crisis, and an increasingly global calls against the crisis of racial and social injustice, without understanding that we have to look at the deep structural features of inequality in our world. And those deep structural inequalities are inextricably intertwined with issues of gender and race of the kind that Justice Marshall and Justice Ginsburg highlighted. And so it is incumbent on law schools, particularly, who are training the future lawyer leaders of the world. And we are about to hear from a great lawyer leader in Dean Lester, who is pioneering a really important program at Columbia Law School on these issues. Lawyers don't have an exclusive title to leadership, but they have a pivotal role to play. And we are seeing more and more the way in which law and the rule of law is fundamentally intertwined with our ability to respond to the deep problems that we see around the world. And that means we need to be training lawyers as leaders, not just as advocates. And to be leaders, those lawyers have to understand the responsibilities that they have to address the deep structural issues of race and gender and inequality that are pervasive in our world today. And so as we celebrate International Human Rights Day and we celebrate the extraordinary life of Justice Ginsburg, we should commit to honor her legacy and the legacy of Thurgood Marshall and Pauli Murray and so many others by recommitting ourselves to putting these issues front and center in the way in which we educate law students, and then we send those law students out to help us restructure our world.
Thank you, David. And Justice Ginsburg was the jurist who epitomized the loyal leader structure that you spoke about. And thank you for reminding us about Read, We Read. This was her first brief to the Supreme Court in 1971, and she cited the UN Charter in that brief. She also cited Sweden's report on gender equality in that brief. And she also mentioned the fact that women as second sex cannot be a norm that can survive the 20th century. So on this day, on this auspicious day on human rights, I cannot channel the spirit of human rights in a more important way than calling upon Zaid Rad Al Hussein, the former High Commissioner for Human Rights, and our own Perry Woldhouse professor at Penn, to speak about Justice Ginsburg's vision of a global human rights dialogue. This was very important to the justice. In 2012, she visited Egypt and Tunisia to mark the first anniversary of the overthrow of the dictatorship. She is someone who has cited international human rights conventions in her rulings. And Judith Resnick of Yale Law School, writing in the Columbia Journal of Gender, has said, one way to honor Justice Ginsburg's path-breaking inquiries is to continue the international human rights dialogue in which she has long engaged. And in fact, when I connected with the great Fumsili about creating this international human rights dialogue in celebrating Justice Ginsburg's legacy, I brought to her notice the fact that the justice had urged us to explore what role the law can play in empowering women in all corners of the world, because that is the role of UN Women. That is the central role of UN Women in using the law to empower women in all corners of the world. So Zaid, as one of the world's most respected human rights defenders, how best do you think we can continue the human rights dialogue in a time of a global inflection point on equality, and at a time when we are at the cusp of reimagining the world in a new vision?
Well, thank you, Rangita, for inviting me in the first place. And I'm honored and delighted to be in the company, as was said by Fumsili, of so many luminaries here. I feel in one way ill-equipped to discuss US constitutional law. I have no real background in it. But speaking to the particular point that you raised, it reminds me of the speech that Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg gave at American University in 2012, at a time when conservative commentators, senators, Republican senators, and even, of course, her colleagues on the bench believed that foreign law or international jurisprudence should have no standing in the rulings of the Supreme Court. And not only did she parry riposte these points, I think very skillfully in her speech to American University, but she also said the Supreme Court, or she believed the Supreme Court would accord, and quoting from the drafters of the Constitution, a decent respect to the opinions of humankind as a matter of comity and in the spirit of humility. And I think it's the spirit of humility, and this is going back to what Justice Abela was saying, it's the spirit of humility when twinned with principle, with standing on the side of those who desperately need the law for a dignified existence, where we can make the most progress. Fumsili also sort of made reference to this, and I know, Rangita, you are someone who enjoys poetry. I recently came across a short poem by Hafiz of Shiraz, and I think it speaks to me because I believe, from a human rights perspective, while mounting defense of a particular norm, we must, on the personal side, always retain some human connection with those with whom we disagree. And we must also refrain from being too sanctimonious, too proselytizing in the way that we discuss these things. And so Hafiz of Shiraz, in his little poem, says it is always a danger to aspirants on the path when they begin to believe and act as if the 10,000 idiots who so long ruled and lived inside have all packed their bags and skipped town or died. And when looking at Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she was formidable in not just the brilliance of her opinions, but I also believe in her example. I mean, she was indefatigable, inexhaustible, really, which was something that endeared her to so many people. But she was also, she had humility, and I think and it was obvious, I think, to all of us that, and to many, that she deeply regretted her approach when it came to Sherrill versus Oneida, and the manner by which lower courts then used her approach to the disadvantage of First Nations. And I think it's that humility twinned with a firmness of position and retaining a sort of humanity when it comes to the way we deal with other people, I think that will allow us to bridge and allow us to continue a dialogue, which will always at times be difficult, but which would allow for progress as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaid, for those powerful words. I call you the poet who is the human rights defender, because first and foremost, you are the poet. And you reminded us about that speech she made at American University. And that was a speech that she made soon after the Arab revolutions, when she advised countries looking for a new constitution to use the Constitution of South Africa as an exemplary standard-setting guiding principles for countries that were emerging democracies. And on that note, I turn to Justice Kempepe, Justice of the Constitution Court of South Africa. President Cyril Ramaphosa appointed you, Justice Kempepe, as the first woman acting Deputy Chief Justice. And you were the first woman to occupy this eminent role. Now, Justice Ginsburg's great friendships with the justices of the Constitution Court is stuff of legend. It is no secret that the justice was a great admirer both of the South African Constitution, but of the justices of the South African, both the Supreme Court and the Constitutional Court. Now, as you know, Justice Kempepe, her jurisprudence was without borders. Your court adopted her jurisprudence. The Indian Supreme Court's Justice Singh and the Chief Justice Balakrishnan relied on what is probably her best known ruling, her ruling in the VMI case, the Virginia Military Institute case, striking down male-only admissions policies in 1996. So why I reminded you of the Indian Supreme Court's adoption of her ruling was to show that what is important today is to remind ourselves that Justice Ginsburg belongs to the world, that she eschewed insularity, that she looked at her jurisprudence as one that would impact and continue to impact the reformist endeavors around the world. So Justice Kempepe, I would like you to speak of the ways in which you and the Constitutional Court continues to be inspired by her and her jurisprudence. Justice Kempepe?
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Ranjita. It is indeed an honor to join this panel of distinguished guests in paying tribute to a scholar, jurist, and a truly remarkable woman whose life's work has made a lasting impact, not only on the law, but on the lives of so many in her country and the world. As we all know, Justice Ginsburg has been influential in shaping equality jurisprudence in her nation and has rightly been hailed around the world as a champion of the right to equality. It is indeed well known that Justice Ginsburg had a soft spot for the South African Constitution. She praised our Constitution as being a great piece of work that she would look to for inspiration if she was ever tasked with drafting a new constitution. As much as the South African Constitution was an inspiration to her, Justice Ginsburg's jurisprudence has also been an inspiration to the South African Constitutional Court. Before I discuss how Justice Ginsburg continues to inspire us, it is necessary to highlight that our respective jurisprudence exists within different judicial landscapes as the constitutions of the United States and South Africa, and the rights they entrench are different in many ways. Despite these differences, Justice Ginsburg is an inspiration to our court, in particular in the manner in which she challenged outdated generalizations and assumptions which underlie discriminatory laws or conduct. She once described gendered stereotypes of parenting roles as stunningly anachronistic, and throughout her jurisprudence, scathingly criticized discriminatory laws which rely on overbroad generalization. Our Constitutional Court has followed suit, strongly criticizing discriminatory conduct based on stereotypes. It has held that discrimination from pervading generalizations and assumption is an assault on human dignity. For example, in Hoffman versus SAA, the court had noted that despite medical evidence as to how HIV is transmitted, prejudices and stereotypes against HIV people still persist. Any discrimination on that basis is a fresh instance of stigmatization, which amounts to unfair discrimination. Of course, without debunking continuing stereotypes that pervade society, we cannot hope to eliminate inequality. The achievement of equality requires the eradication not of just discriminatory barriers in the law, but also of barriers within the minds of the people. In addition to her remarkable impact on equality jurisprudence, Justice Ginsburg left behind a legacy of powerful dicta that sought to address head-on the challenges that her society faces. In order to address our own social ills, courageous and unshrinking judgments are also required from our court. I am thinking in particular about the position of women in South Africa. Our society is not safe or equal until we address the plague of gender-based violence, rape, and femicide that infects it. The recent judgments in the case of Shabalala concerning the common law crime of rape took leaf out of Justice Ginsburg's book and spoke forcefully against this unacceptable scourge, highlighting the power imbalances that permeate our society and influence these gendered attacks. Justice Ginsburg will forever be remembered for her legal brilliance, unwavering determination, and courage. Through her jurisprudence and her life, Justice Ginsburg paved the way for a more equal society. Thanks to trailblazers like her, gender equality is a closer reality than it was when she first joined the bench as the only second female justice of a Supreme Court. However, there is still work to be done. South Africa's scourge of gender-based violence and femicide requires the judiciary to take a stance that is sensitive to the intersectional challenges women face and the power imbalances that pervade our society. This requires creative jurisprudence by our court, as we have continuously attempted to admit. I have no doubt that Justice Ginsburg's jurisprudence and her gumption will continue to be a guiding light for our court in the future. I thank you.
Thank you, Justice Kempepe. Listening to you, I'm reminded of Justice Ginsburg's own words, where she said, "We are the losers if we neglect what others can tell us about endeavors to eradicate bias against women, minorities, and other disadvantaged groups." And that is why she was such an ardent student of South Africa's own jurisprudence. She was also an ardent student of international women's rights conventions, norms, and jurisprudence. And I want to join Fumsile in a call to action to all jurists, including our own jurists here in the United States, to adopt and be shaped by the international human rights conventions, including the CEDAW. When Justice Ginsburg said in the BMI case that sex classification may be used to compensate women for particular economic disabilities they have suffered and to promote equal employment opportunities, she was talking about the importance of addressing a legacy of discrimination against women and other minorities, and the need for temporary special measures or affirmative action to redress those historic grievances. So that is, in terms, consistent with the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and it is a human rights jurisprudence that we want to commit to on International Human Rights Day. So now I turn to Dean Gillian Lester, who leads Justice Ginsburg's Law School. Justice Ginsburg, as we all know, graduated from Columbia Law School, and she herself was appointed as the first woman to Columbia Law School, the first woman faculty at Columbia Law School in 1972. And at her appointment, Justice Ginsburg said, "Sexual discrimination is and will always continue to be my principal interest." Now, Dean Gillian Lester is the Lucy G. Moses Professor of Law, and what I would like to call her, in the justice's favorite Swedish term, a way paver and a path maker. And as David reminded us, Dean Gillian is someone who follows in Justice Ginsburg's footsteps in making way for other women and other jurists as path makers and way pavers. So Dean Lester, my question to you is that 50 years after Justice Ginsburg challenged gender discrimination in the law, gender equality remains the unfinished business of the 21st century. Men still dramatically outnumber women in positions of leadership, and although half of law students, including half of the law students at Columbia Law, are women make up only 12% of managing partners or CEOs of law firms. In the year 2020, fewer than 6.5% of CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are women. The global average for women in legislative bodies is 24.5%, and the gender pay gap could take 170 years to close. So says the World Economic Forum. Now, as you know, Justice Ginsburg famously said in Ledbetter versus Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company that women who were denied equal pay for equal work, that this was an abomination. And her dissent resulted in President Obama signing into law the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act in 2009. Now, if there was pay parity, the global economy could be enriched by $160 trillion, so reports the World Bank. Dean Lester, another way of advancing gender parity and women's leadership in the law is to challenge the unequal caregiving roles of both men and women. And as we've already talked about, in the spate of cases started in the 1970s, Justice Ginsburg challenged sex-based caregiving laws. Now, these norms are part of the global human rights jurisprudence. The CEDAW in Article 5 calls upon states parties to address gender stereotypes, and the Sustainable Development Goal 5, Target 2.4, calls for measuring the value of unpaid work and shared caregiving responsibilities. And Justice Ginsburg, as you know, has often held that until we have real equality among women and men in the household, we won't have women's equality in the labor force. How do you think Dean Lester, her fundamental legal philosophy, will help the world build back better during a time of a public reckoning, both on equality and a time of a public health crisis? Dean Lester?
Thank you, Rangita, for inviting me to speak today and in the company, as other panelists have said, of so many other panelists I greatly admire, and in honor of a person, Justice Ginsburg, whom I personally revere and is one of the true heroes of our time. In 1972, the year, as you pointed out, Rangita, that Justice Ginsburg joined the Columbia faculty, then Professor Ginsburg argued a case that perfectly illustrates the philosophy that you described as Justice Ginsburg's philosophy. The plaintiff, Moritz, a man who had never been married, hired a caregiver to care for his elderly mother so that he could continue to work. He challenged a federal tax law that excluded never married men from a tax deduction for the costs of that caregiver. Then Professor Ginsburg represented Moritz in his successful appeal that led to a holding that the tax law discriminated on the basis of sex. Now, the twist here was that on first blush, this law could be seen as helping women. After all, it specially gave women, but not unmarried men, tax relief if they had to hire a caregiver in order to accommodate their workforce participation. So wouldn't this law help women enter the workforce and therefore advance gender equality? Well, the point at the heart of Justice Ginsburg's theory of equality, and at the time having a deeply radical strain, stretching people's imaginations, was that unless the law embraced both men and women on equal terms, not just as workforce participants, but also as caregivers who might equally need to balance home and work life, there could be no true sex equality. And the Moritz case kicked off a spate of legal challenges to laws that gave unequal access between men and women to state benefits based on sexist stereotypes about their societal roles. Now, there's much lore about how Justice Ginsburg and her beloved husband and tax law professor Marty lived true to these values in their own home life. Justice Ginsburg loved to tell a story about how once when her son's school called her when he was sick and needed to be picked up, she told them he has a father and that they should call Marty, who could go get him. And I know this was not for any lack of love for her son. This was a point of principle that she maintained in her interactions with public institutions. So to the core question of how Justice Ginsburg's legal philosophy relating to gender can guide us during a time of global pandemic. Well, the pandemic exposes and exacerbates numerous threats to gender equality. First, the distribution of jobs and pay are still very gendered. And this has really affected how women have fared during the pandemic. Recent studies have shown that women are concentrated in industries expected to decline the most during the pandemic, such as education and retail trade. Second, the burden of unpaid care, despite the important gains Justice Ginsburg's work helped to achieve, still falls disproportionately on women. Globally, women bear 75% of the burden of household responsibilities such as childcare and elder care, cooking, cleaning. And during the pandemic, this burden has grown substantially as schools have closed, as nursing homes have become higher risk, and as entire families have moved into the home and the strains on the care of the home have increased. This has led to women dropping out of the workforce at higher rates than men. And there's evidence to suggest also that this decline in women's workforce participation, when it's not the result of layoffs, because women are in an industry that's been hard hit, may be shaped by societal assumptions about who stays in the workforce and who drops out when the family comes under strain due to the demands of domestic responsibility. The gender wage gap helps make that decision for families in some cases, because if one member of the parent couple have to drop out, the one who's paid lower wages might make it more efficient for the family. And that means that women will often be the ones who drop out. And sometimes it's just all about societal assumptions about who should be putting more time into family care when the going gets tough. So the pandemic lays bare the ways that societal investments in gender pay equity, state-provided childcare and tax incentives, paid leave programs that support both men and women who separate from work in order to give care, and flexible work hours policies for both men and women are absolutely essential. As we go forward, we need to continue this battle so as to shift women's stubbornly disproportionate burden of unpaid domestic labor. I'll just end on a point that particularly interests me, is how our use of technology, as it takes on new importance after the pandemic is behind us, might enable forms of flexibility that enhance gender equality in workforce participation. I think we'll need to watch carefully to make sure that it enhances participation and doesn't exacerbate isolation of women into more liminal workplace roles. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Lester, for that panoramic sweep of the changes that we will envision and will see in a new world order. And as you pointed out, the Moritz case spawned a series of caregiving law cases for Justice Ginsburg, and it stands as a metaphor for the egalitarian partnership that the justice shared with her husband, because this was a case that the tax lawyer husband brought to her. And just building on some of the stories that you shared with us, hanging in her judicial chambers was a photo of her son-in-law, Clara's father, gazing at his newborn baby. And she would explain the picture as, "This is my dream for society, fathers loving and caring for helping to raise their kids." And she has always said, if I were to invent an affirmative action plan, it would be to give every incentive for men to be primary caregivers of their children along with their mothers. So I want to now go to Amani Aruri, a Palestinian human rights defender, because the causes for which Justice Ginsburg fought in the US are so aligned with what feminist activists like Amani fight for around the world. A recent op-ed in Al Jazeera focused on Justice Ginsburg's legacy of empathy. And the headline stated, "Ginsburg's work has inspired a generation of people who experience outsider status in the US, including Muslims." Now, as we all know, her dissent in the Muslim ban case, along with Justice Sotomayor, was a courageous invocation of religious pluralism. Amani, can you speak of your work in Palestine to advance gender equality and in advancing the draft law, the current draft law on domestic violence, to address the root causes of violence against women? And something that Dean Lester also alluded to was that what we see is that gender inequalities, including violence against women, has become exacerbated during a time of a pandemic. So how do you think, Amani, Justice Ginsburg's gender equality jurisprudence, which has laid a foundation to attack harmful gender stereotypes, can play out in communities such as the communities that you work in, Amani?
Yes, thank you, Ragnita. And this is really important point. And I will start with reminding everyone that also the Israeli occupation has also created and still creating a lot of fragmentation when it comes to the legal system in Palestine. As many of you know, we have different legal systems in Palestine. The Jordanian law in West Bank, which goes back to 1976, the Egyptian legal system in Gaza, which goes back to 1954, and the Israeli legal system for Palestinians living in Jerusalem. So you can imagine the implications of this fragmentation on Palestinian women experiencing injustice and being denied from access to justice due to different reasons. But it's important also to talk about the internal injustice. And I am one of the women, as a Palestinian woman, who who was motivated to work in the field of advocacy, to initiate legal reform and to protect the rights of Palestinian women, as someone who also experienced and lived and still living the implications of the fragmentation of the legal system, and also discrimination against women entrenched in law. It all started when the judge told me in the court, it's not my problem, it is your problem that you chose to get divorced, and you have to forego all of your financial rights. And if in case you get married again, the guardianship will go automatically to the father. So this just created a feeling of anger, a feeling of really refusing this reality for me and for all other Palestinian women. And this is also the case in most of the Arab countries also, that still have not only discriminatory laws, but also have laws that serve as punishment for women who choose to have their own life, to decide for their own. So when we're talking about these laws, it's important to mention the article of the penal code that used to also give exemptions for perpetrators and rapists if they marry their victims. And in this regard, I worked in 2018. I'm proud to lead, among other feminists and other organizations. And here I would like to give the credit to Women's Center for Legal Aid and Counseling, where I used to work. We led a national campaign to demanding abolishing Article 308 of the Penal Code. And we were successful in March 2018. The president appealed this article of the law, and also with announced other reforms regarding the punishment of the rapists and perpetrators. But still, we still have many gaps in the law. Now, when we talk about the family protection bill, it's really a prominent issue in Palestine. So the inherited patriarchal social structure, which is also, as I mentioned, embedded in not only in the legal system, but also in the education system, and the existence of pushback forces in the policy making and decision making level against the legal and social reforms, all make the change process almost intangible, although a lot have been done. But it, the relationship between the efforts that have been done and still being done by the social and feminist movements and the results legal reforms we're seeing on ground, it's non-linear, and it's really improportionate. Like the demands to initiate legal reforms and to have the family protection bill passed, it have been a struggle we have been having since more than 14 years, and still the draft is being reviewed by the Ministers' Council and by the President, and every time we have a different excuse. But it is apparent that there is no political will to enforce this law. And despite the hard efforts made by civil society and fighters for gender justice, even from within the government. So when we're talking about women in leadership positions, they are also under pressure. They demand legal reforms, but when they are working from within the system, they also experience pushbacks and experience pressure from the top policy makers. There are many forms of discrimination, including birth registration, personal status law, gaps in accountability for domestic violence. Another example, also marital rape is still not considered to be a crime according to the Palestinian law. And here, when we talk about demanding legal reforms, this has also implications on the women's movement and the feminist movement, because also we have a lot of pressure from the anti-gender equality movement. When we talk about CEDAW, we still experience currently a big anti-feminism movement, claiming that this is against the social, like this would destroy the social fabrics of the Palestinian society. This is against Islam and so on. So it is really also faced by the government, and they believe that this would put pressure on the government. But of course, there should be simultaneous efforts. Like we always tackle this question, we face this question, what should come first? Is it changing the social norms or changing the laws and reforming the laws and the legal system? And I say definitely we should work on both sides together, because if you you will not be able to change social norms if the laws and the policies are discriminatory. So there is no way of changing the perception, changing the social norms, and eliminating the discrimination and stereotypes against women if the law itself, it makes it really normal to violate women's rights, and it really perceive it as something in the hands of family to kill a woman, to kill a daughter or a wife, because in law the killer would have a reduced sentence because he's keeping the honor of the family. It's true we had some reforms, but we still need more. We still have a long way to go, but definitely there is hope. There is always hope of achieving change.
Thank you, Amani. Thank you. And we congratulate you on your relentless work on addressing honor crimes and all other forms of discrimination against women. Bringing this back to Justice Ginsburg, Justice Ginsburg was an ardent follower of what was happening post-revolutions in Egypt and in Tunisia. And Tunisia also, because of the pressure by the women's movement, revised its penal code that allowed the rapist to marry his victim as a way of cleansing him of his crime and avoiding any kind of judicial action. So thank you, Amanda, for the work that Amani, for the work that you're doing, because it is so much in line with the way in which Justice Ginsburg step by step dismantled discrimination in law and in practice. Amanda Nguyen, at Sundance in 2018, for the first time in public, Justice Ginsburg spoke of her own Me Too story about an encounter at Cornell in her chemistry class. Now, Amanda, you survived rape while studying to be an astrophysicist at Harvard, and you used that experience to draft a survivor's Bill of Rights. Now, of the Me Too movement, Justice Ginsburg has said that I think it will have staying power because people, and not only women, but men as well as women, realize how wrong the behavior was and how it subordinated women. As Dean Lester argued, Justice Ginsburg was someone who made men a central figure in her fight for equality. She said that the Constitution was a double-edged sword where women's equality would result in equality for all, including men. So what is the role, Amanda, that you think men can play in the Me Too movement globally, and how your own work coincides with that work of the Me Too movement globally? Amanda?
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to speak with such incredible company about a legendary human who has left an indelible mark on the world and a mark on our hearts. There's a well-worn tradition of people, taking their painful living truths and channeling that into justice. And Justice Ginsburg joined that tradition through her life's work and paved the pathway for people like me to exercise my rights. I remember how difficult it was to share my own Me Too story, to talk about my rape. I cannot imagine what it must have been like for Justice Ginsburg to talk about her Me Too story. And by sharing her story, she showed solidarity and recognized the immense bravery that it takes for survivors to come forward, survivors that include men and all genders. And she showed us that justice is a journey fought for, by, and with the community. And this helps one gain perspective not only of our moment in time, but our place in shaping history, the intertwined threads that make up the fabric of movement building. You know, there's a story I want to share that exemplifies both the solidarity aspect that you mentioned with Justice Ginsburg sharing her story and also the role of men. You see, the first time that I talked to any politician about why the law should reflect our lived experiences, at least mine as a rape survivor, I went home and I cried because it was really tough. And as a pathological optimist, which is somewhat required of being an activist, I got up the next day again and went to the United States Senate. And in my Uber ride to the Senate, I met a driver, a man, who was intimidating, a little stoic. But at the end of the ride, he saw where I was going. He asked me where I was going, and he asked me why. And I told him, and this once intimidating man started crying, just tears welling up from his eyes. And he looked at me and he said, "My daughter is a rape survivor too." And he said, when he stopped the car, "She went through exactly what you went through. Thank you so much for fighting for my daughter. Has anyone told you that they love you today? I love you." And I'll never forget that, Dad. No, this story is our story. It's a collective story of progress. And by calling on men to join the fight, Justice Ginsburg acknowledges the importance of male allyship, calling all of us to be better angels of our nature, to be there for survivors. Her existence gave hope to an America and to a world that we have been promised to live up to the meaning of our creed through hard work, that we could still remake this world into a fairer place. She represents a world that puts forth the best in all of us, and essentially that no one is powerless when we come together, and no one is invisible when we demand to be seen.
Thank you, Amanda. Your story is our story, and it evokes the better angels of our spirit. We admire your courage. And during her first oral argument, Justice Ginsburg, before the Supreme Court in 1973, in Frontier versus Richardson, she challenged the assumption that a man is not likely to be a dependent spouse when she quoted Sarah Grimke, a 19th century abolitionist and suffragette, when she said, "I ask the court no favor for my sex. All I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet off our necks." And that taking the feet off our necks is something, a cry that needs to be heard in every corner of the world, where unfortunately those words still ring true. Feet still remain on the necks of women, and the girl child is devalued. The justice spoke to that directly 27 years ago in 1993 in the Rose Garden in her acceptance speech, when she spoke of a time to come when daughters are cherished as much as sons. And that aligns so well with Amanda's own story of the importance of allyship, male allyship. And finally, I echo Secretary Hillary Clinton's words when she said, "There will never be another like her." But many young women like Amanda, like Armani, carried her torch. So now I turn to Clara Spera to moderate the next session. Clara, her granddaughter, carries her torch. Clara is the standard bearer of her legacy. And while all of you who have joined this conversation have a duty to strengthen her legacy in every corner of the world, because this is her global legacy, and Justice Ginsburg belongs to the world. I turn to Clara to speak about the ways in which a new generation of women can come to the forefront as standard bearers of the Justice's global legacy. Thank you to my eminent panelists for your insights, your reflections, your stories, and the ways in which you carry forward her global legacy. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Rangita. What a marvelous, marvelous discussion. Before we turn over to Clara, I would just like to inquire. I've just had some intelligence that UN Special Representative on Sexual Violence and Conflict, Pramila Patten, is on this conversation. Are you there, Pramila? If you are, can you just chat in the Q&A to say you're there, and if you are, then we will give you video and audio rights so that you can actually make your comment if you're there, Pramila. And even if not now, we can even come back to you after the second panel if you're there, Pramila. And before I turn it over to Clara, I just wanted to say that always, but especially today, democracy is not just something that is handed down to people. It is something that all citizens are engaged in as a daily endeavor. And the upholding of human rights and law is an expression of justice and equality that is central to this democratic engagement. The law and constitutions reflect the highest aspirations of what a society holds dear and how it holds itself accountable. And Justice Ginsburg upheld this idea centrally. And so as we move into this next discussion, it would be really wonderful to hear how her vision of rights and justice and her global legacy continue with this pursuit of equality for all those that are working on constitutional interpretations, feminist constitutional interpretations. Thank you so much. And before we will move into Clara, but just before that, we have a small spoken word poem to share with you from a young poet who speaks to these very issues. And after that, straight over to you, Clara.
Today is a promissory note to the women who will come after us. We do not wait tomorrow because we call our fathers when night is a prayer home. The sidewalk's sleek teeth sharp against our shadows. We do not wait tomorrow because we might not make it. We are taught to envy legs long enough to outrun death. We do not wait tomorrow because a girl child will marry before her knees kiss the asphalt of a school playground. Because we name our children headlines. Because we cannot breathe. Because with no knock, our beds can turn casket in the blink of a night. Today, some will sleep off hunger with the promise of tomorrow, so we do not wait. Instead, we sit at every table decisions are made. Demand an equal serving and lick the plate clean. The table, a glass ceiling we see ourselves in. We fill our mouths with words the kitchen has no use for. Conjure the women who unhinged the doors before us. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Oluwatoyin Salau, Ella Baker. We hold our feminists to our chests like icons. Nadia Murad, Malala Yousafzai, Gloria Steinem, my mother. We say their names till it fills the room, until we keep the promises of the Beijing Declaration, until consent is everyone's first language, until education is not a gated community, until women participate equally in decision-making, until every country achieves gender equality, until we do not put off until tomorrow what we can do today.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to the first panel. I'm hoping that our second panel, which I have the honor of chairing, which is designed to focus on equality in the law, how feminist interpretations of the law can promote equality both in public and private life. We'll continue to draw on themes that we heard from our panelists in the first panel. And to that end, I may reference some of what we just heard. I'd like to start with Justice Susan Glazebrook of the Supreme Court of New Zealand. Thank you so much for your time at what I understand is a very early morning in New Zealand. So first of all, just many thanks from all of us for being here. And I'd like to draw from your the example of New Zealand and think about what lessons the rest of the world can learn from your country. In 1893, my understanding is that New Zealand was the very first country in the world to grant universal suffrage by giving women the right to vote. The country is currently led by a nationally and internationally celebrated female prime minister, Jacinda Ardern. And of course, the country's highest court is led by a woman, and there are a majority of women on that court. My understanding is that of the active 5 justices, 3 are women. Can you discuss why you believe New Zealand has been so successful in promoting and supporting women to hold high political and legal office, and also discuss where you think there still remains room for improvement? On that latter point, where there still remains room for improvement, I do think there is a tendency to assume that women in high places must mean equality in all aspects of life. But we know that beneath the titles, insidious forms of gender bias can still prevail, especially targeted towards women of color and Indigenous women. So what on those fronts, what work does New Zealand still have left to do?
Thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here, and an honor, of course, to meet you, Clara. I have met your mother, and we've hosted her in the Supreme Court in New Zealand. And I also had the exceedingly great honor when I first became a judge to meet both your grandmother and grandfather, in fact, in Auckland and New Zealand when they were touring. So it is a particular honor to be here on this day and to meet you and all of the other panelists. It's interesting, the sort of comments that you make, especially the women in high places, the assumption that that means there's equality through the board. And I think there's also the assumption that as soon as you have a few women in high places, that the work is done. And of course, the issue with that is that people in high places, as you can imagine, the Prime Minister will change. If there's an election, that can mean that there's a different Prime Minister. The same applies in other women in high places. And if you haven't made sure that further down the chain you have a proper equality of women, then there are going to be difficulties later, because that apparent equality that appears at the top can dissipate in a very short time. In terms of the work that New Zealand has to do, the list is endless. Family violence is a major problem in New Zealand. It is a national shame. The child poverty is a problem in New Zealand, again, a national shame. There are some positive aspects to it. Obviously, the government and the current government, and in fact other governments, have had a commitment to try and do something about all of these issues in our society. These are not issues that are easy to resolve. And as you say, women of colour and Indigenous women are very much the bottom of the heap. And again, a national shame in terms of our past treatment of Indigenous peoples and and the current inequalities that still remain. None of this is very, we have to think of solutions, I think, and we have to have some optimism that in fact currently, at least in New Zealand and I think elsewhere, there have been some major improvements, at least in the commitment to change. And I think finally things are probably just starting to change. Of course, the sort of things that Rosie Abella was talking about earlier are real issues in the world. So there are these competing things where we have that will to change, but also that real concern that authoritarianism and populism are going to take away those gains that we've made.
Thank you, Justice Glazebrook. And I hope to, toward the end of the panel, put some of the panelists in conversation with one another. And I'm particularly interested in intergenerational conversations. And we're very lucky that on this panel we have many generations represented who I hope can learn from one another. I'd like to turn now to former Prime Minister Aminata Touré, the former Prime Minister of Senegal from 2013 2014. And thank you also for being with us today. It's a real honor to meet you, though virtually. In 2010, Senegal passed what I understand has been dubbed one of the most radical gender quota laws, requiring all political parties to place women and men in an alternating manner on candidate lists, aiming at a male-female ratio of 50% representation in government. Similar to the type of question that I asked Justice Glazebrook about the difference between representation in high places and the actual impact on lived experiences on the ground, can you reflect on the successes of that particular law and discuss whether you think other countries can learn from the Senegalese example?
Well, thank you very much. Happy to be part of this conversation. Actually, there is no explanation to be given why we should have 50-50. That's just because it has to do that way. So that's, most of the time my response. But it's the result of a long process. Senegal has a long tradition of women organization being very active as civil society organization. It goes all the way back to colonization times. Women have, have a standing, and they've been involved in decolonization struggle. So that carried on, after independence. So we do have very active women civil society organization here and very strong political leaders. So that is the background of how this occurred. And I have to recognize that President Abdoulaye Wade at that time, who was an old man, accepted to pass the law at the parliament where he had a majority of parliamentarians. He was in his 70s, late 70s, and it passed. Although there was some of a political calculation behind it, but we took it and we had what we call a 50-50 parity law, which described exactly what you said. When you run, whether it is a parliamentarian, municipal election, you have to have a list in a zipper way, a man or women, usually that's a man leading it actually. And if you don't do that, you cannot run. Your list is out of the election. So at the beginning, I think, traditional forces were not paying too much attention to that until they saw the overwhelming number of women coming to parliament. And of course, the reaction was to say, this is going to dilute the quality of the debate, as if when men was there, the debate were great. So we are not going to fight for mediocracy equality, but in terms of participation, I don't see why we should not be 50 and the men 50. And as a matter of fact, and now we are at the 8th year of that law, we didn't see, and many evaluations have been made, we didn't see a drop of quality. I would not say that it increased dramatically, but at least we didn't see that drop of quality in the debates, because we can, you do have very, very qualified women, very strong women representing their community. So the process can be duplicated everywhere. It's a matter of enacting a law. I mean, as a matter of fact, it's a matter of respecting constitutional provision everywhere. So I do think that, and that's the work to be done, that the countries and states must be held accountable for what they have signed. They have signed CEDAW, they have provision in their constitution, so they have to apply it and pass the law to make sure that we have 50-50 representation in elective structures. Now, the other challenge is appointment positions, which are the strongest, within cabinet, heading big national companies. There, we are not making much progress so far. And the work we are doing is to push the president, because that's him appointing people, to make sure that in his government, he has 50-50, and we are far from that. We have to say that. So we still have struggle to fight, and we must do it with the men, because we also had, during that process, sort of a nice coalition between the women movement, the young people movement, and some feminist men. So I think the idea of building broader coalition that goes beyond just women organization is very important. In Senegal, we have a very tolerant and open Islam. 97% of Senegalese are Muslim, but yet we have a very tolerant way of practicing Islam. And that also allowed women movement to ally with very moderate Muslim leaders who are saying, yes, women should participate. There is no provision in the Quran saying that they should not, and why not vote for that law? So there was some religious leaders sitting at the parliament who also supported the law and voted for it. Now, the other question is how that affects the status of women nationally. Of course, when we talk about rural women, when we talk of disfranchised women, there is a lot to be done. But having women sitting at municipal council dealing with local issues, believe me, made a huge difference in terms of how we're going to spend the budget at the village level, how we're going to make sure that the issues related to social issues that women face are going to be addressed through the budget. It made a difference. When they are there, they can influence, they can put the pressure, so the budget goes where women's needs are. So that is also something we have to say. So in a nutshell, I would say that's not the whole story, being present, but being present is key. First, because it's a right, we don't have to explain why, but because we can see that women can influence how budget is spent to realize the rights of women. And that's something that can be definitely duplicated everywhere. We have to hold the states, the government, to be accountable for what they have signed for and just do it.
Thank you so much. I'd like to continue drawing on this theme of what it means to be represented and to be at the table by turning now to Professor Rode of Stanford Law School. In the previous panel, we heard Professor Wilkins of Harvard draw parallels between Justice Ginsburg's advocacy and Justice Marshall, for whom you also clerked. And you have spoken about how representation itself, does not always equate to empowerment. And you've drawn specifically on the example of Justice Clarence Thomas replacing Justice Marshall, whose approach to legal interpretation could not be more different from Justice Thomas's, and indeed whose jurisprudence is in direct conflict with Justice Thomas's civil rights advocacy and majority opinions. On the other hand, Justice Ginsburg famously said that there would be enough women on the Supreme Court when there are 9, and she did not opine on whom should nominate those 9 or what sort of spectrum those 9 should represent. So I won't ask you to opine on the newly confirmed Justice Barrett here on this panel, but rather discuss more broadly the idea that representation itself does not always equate to advancement for any particular minority or oppressed class, and in fact that sometimes representation can be a shadow for backtracking on advancements. Oh, Professor Rode, I believe you are muted, which is the quote of 2020, by the way.
Thank you so much for, especially to Rangita, whose work has been so instrumental, not just in bringing us all together here, but advancing the causes of women's rights and social justice throughout the world for decades. You know, I think it's, Clara, you've underlined a really important point. Empowering women is not the same as putting women in power. It depends which women. And there's a long history. Margaret Thatcher comes immediately to mind, who did not do much for the women's rights agenda in Great Britain, had none famously in her cabinet, didn't make women's issues a priority. So it so depends on which women and with what constituency they identify that makes a difference. And I think that brings me to the legacy of Justice Ginsburg, because no individual in recent memory did more than she did to transform the legal landscape for the better on matters involving gender. In the United States, although the history of women was one of discrimination, it wasn't until the 1970s that the Supreme Court found it was unconstitutional. And its initial decisions were shaped by Ginsburg as the co-founder and litigation strategist of the ACLU's Women's Rights Project. And during the 70s, that project brought hundreds of cases. One that Jillian Lester spoke about, involving gender bias. Ginsburg herself had 5 victories in landmark cases in the Supreme Court before she was appointed to the bench. And as Rangita noted earlier, her strategy was so informed and advanced for her time because she represented male as well as female plaintiffs, which helped an all-male court understand the injustice of laws based on archaic gender stereotypes that restricted the roles of both sexes. And after being appointed to the court as a second woman justice, she authored many of the country's landmark decisions and dissents involving gender in all areas that are important to women's empowerment, education, employment, and reproductive justice. And her inspiring story in overcoming discrimination and health challenges has really inspired millions of women and has gained her iconic status on t-shirts, teacups, and tote bags, all of which testify to a life lived greatly in pursuit of social justice. And because this is a global conference, I should also note that she was a pioneer among American judges in relying on international law. In a celebrated address by the use of human rights standards on torture from outside the United States, she stated, "I frankly don't understand all the brouhaha lately from Congress and even some colleagues about referring to foreign law." As she noted, the failure to recognize its merits had limited the influence and quality of US court decisions. The Canadian Supreme Court, she noted, is probably cited more broadly than the US Supreme Court. And the reason she pointed out is that you will not be listened to if you do not listen to others. An address before the International Academy of Comparative Law made that point in its title. It was called "A Decent Respect to the Opinions of Humankind, the Value of a Comparative Perspective on Constitutional Adjudication." And it is in that spirit, I think, that convenings like this one that bring so many individuals concerned with social justice from across the world to learn from each other's experience. Finally, I should just pick up on a theme that was noted earlier and is an important part of the justice's legacy. She was a model for the advice that we often give to younger women, that the most important decision you will make in life is the partner you choose. Find someone, she said, who treats your career as important as his or her own. And her marriage was a textbook case. Jillian Lester gave one illustration. I'll give another. When her husband, Marty, developed testicular cancer while they were both students at Harvard Law School, she attended and took notes on his classes as well as her own while taking care of him and their young daughter and managing to graduate at the top of her class. He repaid the support, as she later noted, in spearheading her nomination to the Supreme Court and doing all the hard lobbying and organizing work to make it possible. I think it is so rare to see two people in the same field so free from envy and self-interest and so committed to each other. And I'll close with just one story. When I had the good fortune to be on a panel with her at a large professional gathering, and I had breakfast with she and Marty before the event. And she was then recovering from one of her challenges with pancreatic cancer and was extremely frail. And Marty said to her as she sat down, "Now, Ruth, it's 9 hours till dinner, so you need a real breakfast." And when it came and she just kind of picked at it, you reminded her, "Ruth, it's not enough to order carbohydrates. You actually have to eat some. You like French toast," he reminded her. And that story sticks in my mind because it is so emblematic of the world she wanted to see, the kind of mutual support and concern from those close personal relationships. We should all be so lucky, and we are all in her debt.
Thank you, Professor Rhode. I think that line, that empowering women is not the same thing as putting women in power, will stick with me, and hopefully sort of we can expand on that a little bit as we continue the panel. I'd like to now turn to Anika Jane Dorothy, the East Africa coordinator of Amplify Girls, among other many incredibly impressive titles. Sort of like Amanda from the first panel, you and I are of the same generation, and in our own countries and experiences, we've been able to reap the benefits of the incredible fights that my grandmother and those before and after her fought on our behalf. While my grandmother was one of 9 in her law school class, I was in a law school class that was comprised of 50% women. While my grandmother was not seriously considered for a job in most law firms, despite being the first in her class, both at Harvard and Columbia law schools, I and my classmates received a barrage of seemingly never-ending recruitment solicitations from the private sector. So in other words, I've been able to glide through the doors that she and her contemporaries forced open and that women of our mother's generation held open. So if you'll allow me to stretch the metaphor, what should people, and not just women of our generation, do to ensure that those doors stay open?
Thank you, Claire. Quite an honor to have the opportunity to honor Justice RBG, and someone coined her notorious RBG. Our generation has been known for revolting and challenging the status quo, and I am no exception. In honoring RBG, I really reflect on how she challenged systems, and I realize that that is what we are doing today, rewriting the script and building off of what women like RBG did. And I remember back to the time when I was in the university, and despite her being so far away in the USA, landmark rulings like Roe versus Wade trickled down all over the world to allow girls to be able, and young women to be able to have autonomy over their own bodies. And in looking at how we are able to pass this on, I remember being in the university as a woman wanting to run for office and noting that in our executive body that ran student issues, there were, it was a body of 19 men and traditionally had a seat for 2 women. And in overturning this constitution, we decided to go the Senegal way and say we need people, officials of opposite gender. And that today has resulted in the University of Nairobi having the first female chair of the student union, something that has never been, heard of ever since. So I feel like it is instances like this that we give birth to for the next generation. And as much as I am not so old now, I still have younger girls who are coming on board and having the platform to run and to be in these spaces because of some of the things that we have done. And I look back to in politics and leadership, in the systems that we have today, I feel like women need to build the systems. And I say this over and over, and this is why I formed the Young Women in Political Parties Leadership, because we have to create the environment that is amiable enough, fair enough, just enough for women to run. And this starts by ensuring that all our political parties have 50-50 gender parity, that we are able to influence nomination processes, we are able to influence election boards, so that we don't have a situation where as a panel of a few gray-haired men tell us that you cannot run or it is not yet your time, as they did to Hillary in 2008. And we have to be aware of the systems that are around us. And as Deborah said, and Aminata said earlier, that sometimes we do have, women as agents of patriarchy. And we have a lot of young women coming up unaware of how to fit in this space, looking for knowledge, how to fit in this space of feminism. And this is where the academic body comes on board. I hope some of them are still here. When I was trying to look for a course in my master's course, there was no feminist course. And I went to the Department of Political Science and I was just about to register. And I met someone who told me they're off to the African Women's Studies Center, which has just been newly created. And sorry for the noise. I'm sure they'll take care of it, sorry. So the African Women's Studies Center was a space, it was the first feminist space for African women at the University of Nairobi. And this was founded by Professor Wanjiku Kabira. And what I realized is that we don't understand the power we have as women, the agency of women and girls. We do not understand it as much as we would if we were able to have the space to acquire these feminist knowledges. And so in answering you, Claire, I would say, I think it is pertinent. We cannot underscore enough the importance of creating feminist spaces and feminist avenues for people like us to be able to learn, to understand how to properly advocate for women. And it is very difficult to stand as a woman advocating and challenging systems. Very difficult to be able to overturn a situation or have, as RBG mostly had, a dissenting view from what is normal. But in creating these spaces, we are using knowledge and using the academic space, we can be able to ably contribute, because as Aminata said before, some people think that bringing women into the space of leadership, into the space of decision making, is diluting the space. How so? How can they be so unaware of the power and the brain power that we bring to the table? So I remain very passionate about ensuring that we do not leave our generation behind in reminding them of the tenets of to why we are here. And in creating the spaces, we need to be able to pull all our young women into all the spaces that decisions are being made. And if I'm to just repeat one of RBG's famous captions, she said, sometimes she was asked, when will there be enough women, for example, in the Supreme Court bench? And she said, when they are 9. And people are shocked because there had been 9 men, but nobody questioned that. So I say that it could be 50-50. It could also be 80-90, 80-100, but either way,
we have to invest in systems that create an amiable environment for women to get equal pay, access to justice, and sealing all the legal loopholes that we go through today. Thank you.
Thank you. And I actually want to draw specifically on what you just touched on, which is the amiable environment idea, that it's not just the space itself, but what women encounter and others encounter when they actually reach those spaces. And to talk about that, I'd like to turn to Yasmin Hassan, the Global Executive Director of Equality Now. We heard Dean Lester in the previous panel touch on the notion that in her practice as an advocate while at the ACLU, then litigator Ginsburg focused on laws that on their face seem to protect or prize women. For example, exempting them from jury service. Part of her theory of change was that the pedestal on which women were thought to stand turned out to be a cage. So drawing on your current work and also prior work, including implementing the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, I'm interested in your perspective on the reasoning that undergirds and motivates the discrimination that your organization fights against today, and how to combat that underlying reasoning, especially when it can be at times so embedded in national traditions or religion.
Thank you, Clara. That is a great question. And I do want to say that Equality Now is founded, it's inspired by the legacy, not even the legacy until recently, the work of Justice Ginsburg. And we are devastated, like honestly devastated by her loss. Just right now, actually, while we were having the first panel, I got a delivery and it's a mug which says, "Mary Resist Miss." So I thought this was very apt to you, and I'm having my tea in it while we have this panel. Your question is it's very good. Justice Ginsburg, among other things, was an amazing strategist. I think getting women's rights on the agenda and to see them to fruition is a question of strategy around the world. And I think there are certain things that have changed since her time and other things that remain the same. I mean, she really used to have male plaintiffs in cases of discrimination as a matter of strategy, because she saw who held the power and who is she speaking to, who will make the change, first for men who feel discriminated against, and then that change will trickle down to women. And certain things have changed. Okay, from that time, number one, 85% of world constitutions have gender equality in their provisions and they guarantee equality. And there are many, many countries around the world that have used those provisions to actually seek equality for women. Number two, the international legal framework has gotten significantly developed, whether it's the international or regional frameworks. I mean, we talked to Aminata and Anika right now. Maputo Protocol is one of the most far-ranging treaties on women's rights ever, and that's in the African context. So there's been a lot of development there. Equality Now basically focuses on holding governments to account for equality, but for us, as for other people, it is a matter of strategy. And our main strategy is look at the women's rights movements in the countries involved. What is it that they are fighting for? Very often, those movements are marginalized in the countries that they speak of. I'm very happy to hear from Aminata and also Nika in Kenya and Senegal. There are very vibrant movements, but in a lot of countries, those movements are marginalized. And Equality Now's job is to take them and lift them, bring them to international attention and create momentum for their change, right? Now, I know that we believe, just like Justice Ginsburg did, that women's rights is the right thing. It is a human rights matter, and there should be equal rights for all. We also know that equality for women legally is just the first step towards gender equality, because we've heard so much about it is the cultural change that is necessary, the behavioral change that is necessary to make this de facto reality, So what I would say is that while it's the right thing to do, very often we have to use arguments saying it's the smart thing to do to convince people that by doing women's rights and giving women's rights, the country's development will be enhanced. or that men will benefit in other ways, or that it is a matter of peace and security. Recently, we've had a lot of studies coming out of Harvard and other places which definitely link gender equality to the level of peacefulness at society. And when we look at as equality now, when we look around the world and when we are taking our cases to governments, we argue on all these fronts to see what actually sticks. Right. So to me, and you know, my kids are, you guys are, you and Nika, different generation. My kids always say to me, it's not our burden to tell people that this is the right, to explain ourselves. And I was like, unfortunately for me and my cohorts, it is still our burden to tell people that why they must believe in gender equality. And you talked a little bit about religion, right? Like religion and custom, which we see as the biggest barriers to women's rights. Also, when we have constitutional equality, a lot of countries have exceptions for religion. That's what we see in ratification of CEDAW also. There are exceptions for religion. And I think that that is a big barrier that we have to cross. And, you know, when I actually came into the women's rights movement because I was a 9-year-old kid when we got martial law in Pakistan, which is where I come from. And at that time, the military dictator used Islam as a way to legitimize his rule. And he said, I'm going to bring Islamic law for everybody. And what did he bring as Islamic law? Everything that took down women to second-class citizens. Women couldn't sign contracts on their own. They couldn't give evidence in court. And perhaps worst of all, if a woman was raped and couldn't prove it, she could be flogged for fornication, right? So this is what Islamic law meant. And it was a sea change in the country that I lived in, which was, you know, was on the up and up for women's rights. And that's what led to the women's rights movement there. What we in the human rights movement and the women's rights movement have avoided is the issue of religion. And just this year, and when I look at sex discriminatory laws around the world, where we have had the least progress is laws that are sanctified by religion. So those are mainly family laws. And family is the center unit of a society, right? And if you have inequality in a family, you are not going to reap the benefits of equality. You can say as much as, oh, there's going to be full participation of women or education of women, but in your family, you inherit less than your brother. You can be forced to be married off as a child. You can't work without the permission of your father or your husband. There are all these kind of laws. So finally, in March this year, we launched a global campaign on family laws with women's rights groups that are working within the framework of religion. One of them is Musawa, which is a global campaign, a global group that looks at Sharia and says that we have, as feminists and as women, have avoided looking at religion and making it our own and having our voices. You know, Aminata talked a little bit about getting moderate religious leaders to chime in. I think it's very important, and that's what Musawa and groups like that are doing. We're also working with Swedish Council on Churches and other to see how can we reform religious laws and those outlook. So I know this is a long-winded answer, but again, it's a matter of strategy. Context around the world in very many countries is very different. You have to look at what exists and what's the best way of change. So I'm always inspired by your grandmother and the strategies she adopted. And it also gives us pause to look at, be real on what is possible and how to go about it. So I'll stop there. Yeah.
No, thank you, Yasmin. Well, you specifically referenced her, so I'd like to bring Prime Minister Toure back into the conversation to reflect both on what Yasmin said and also the conversation as it's evolved since you spoke last about the sort of distinctions between representation, qua representation for its own sake, and actual empowerment.
Yes, but I like to maybe sort of see how the message and the fight of Justice Ginsburg would translate into an African context. And when I say that, it addressed both men and women, and that's what gender is all about, right? Mm-hmm. I must say that these days it's a very blurry concept when you talk about human rights in Africa. For a lot of people, it comes down to the right to just survive in substandard quality of life. When you discuss with young people, that's how they translate human rights, and it's very sad actually, which is a part of how conservative our word became over time. I'm not very sure that the Declaration of Human Rights would have been voted in the UN Assembly if we present it today. I'm not very sure about that. So the more we talk about human rights, the less realistic it seems to the 200 million of African young people. So that is very important also to know. The promise of the rights to live a life of dignity sounds like a promise never to be fulfilled. And progress, of course, has been made in many areas: health, right to education, women representation, as I said. But the crisis of employment put a sort of hierarchy of rights, although we all are talking about the indivisibility of rights. But I always challenge that concept, because there definitely a hierarchy of human rights security component. So, I mean, you have to be alive, first of all, to go to school, etc. So the concept of progressive realization is there to put benchmark, of course, in the compendium of right. But yet, in my context, it became harder, it becomes harder and harder to talk about right in general terms. It has become very practical to young people. The number one priority being access to professional skills and decent job for young women and young boys. So I would like to see much more intellectual development, because we do have scholars on these fields. I'm not downplaying the other set of rights, but when 70% of the African population is below 35-year-old, it is urgent that these very specific rights of access to decent job be addressed in a very operational manner. In West Africa, we do have security threat generated by radical religious groups, which build upon joblessness of young people who are looking for economic prospect. When those groups control territories, guess what? There is no much left for the human rights agenda. And the first right to be attacked are women's rights, and that we know that.
Yeah.
So we should challenge the human rights the scholar community to work with job creation experts to suggest clear plan for operationalizing the rights to decent jobs, especially in youth-dominant countries like all African countries. Not addressing that very specific right is a very serious danger for the stability and even the existence of countries. No matter how advanced the human rights agenda was in those countries, they roll back all the changes. We have border with Mali, and they're occupying all North Mali. There is no rights there for anyone. Women's rights disappeared overnight. So let's remember also pre-Civil War Afghanistan in the 70s. That was the most advanced countries on human rights in the region. So what happened when radical groups, religious groups took the country? We can see that. So I'm very sensitive to this issue, as we lost in the matter of 4 weeks here in Senegal, more than 500 young people trying to cross the ocean in traditional wooden boat. And among these 500, there were women trying to cross the ocean to reach Europe or even the Americas. Mind you, you need 8 hours of flight to get to America and 5 hours to get to Europe. So imagine how long that trip can be. And they're doing it to search, economic prospect. So, and the saddest part of this already sad story is that we are losing the most courageous and the most success-driven young people, including young women. So my advocacy, as I was doing that when I was heading the human rights branch in UNFPA, is how can we make operational the promise of human rights, so we can put pressure on decision makers to take the decision we want them to take in order to realize the rights. So we move to the advocacy part to being very, very concrete in what kind of program do we need to put forward to address the rights. Being on the law part, being in the economic front, being in the gender budgeting part, etc. So I think that is a challenge I like to share with the scholars, so we can see that the human rights language is followed by very concrete proposition to realize those rights for women and for men.
Thank you, Prime Minister Toure. I mean, though you draw from specific examples of countries within Africa, I think you are hitting on a broader theme, which is just how fragile some of these foundations for human rights and gender equality can be. And so I'd like to actually go back to Justice Glazebrook in New Zealand and to sort of expound on that idea of the fragility of foundations, because in your country, as we discussed, we have an example where we see women in positions of power, and yet you also discussed, how much work there still is left to do, especially with respect to things like family violence. And from my perspective, I think that it's easy for my generation to take certain things for granted, and not to recognize the fragility of some of these foundations. And so, what advice or guidance would you give to the younger people, whether of New Zealand specifically or more broadly, to resist the temptation to assume that these gains in gender equality, for example, are permanent tenets of the country that they live in?
I'm avoiding the tag of the day, you're on mute, by managing to unmute myself. It's interesting to me, really, and I think just taking a particular example of young women who've been at law school, they've been now, I think in our country, they're the majority of people at law school. They've had a lot of success at law school, they've had a lot of success all through school. They then get out into the workplace, and while, as you say, it was your experience, Clara, that they find jobs really easily, what they do find after a certain time is that there are barriers to them being able to continue in those jobs. There are barriers for them to advance in the way that they'd like to advance. There are also barriers in the sense of living the lives that they want to live, living those balanced lives, being able to look after their families in a way that they would like to. The same, I think, applies to young men, in fact, because a lot of young men now want to have that involvement in their families that their fathers perhaps only dreamed of. Well, at least we hope they dreamed of it and didn't enjoy what they were doing, which some of them, of course, I think did. So I think that's a real shock to some of those young women. And the advice really, I suppose, is that you can't assume that those gains are gains that are going to be there forever, or even that are there now. But you do have to have that optimism for the future. You can't give up on those gains. You have to think about it in an incremental manner. In terms of the people who don't have those opportunities, and of course in New Zealand, we probably are very lucky in that we are a country where we have a reasonable quality of life, even with the child poverty, etc., that I've talked about. It's nothing like the sort of poverty that we're talking about in some other nations, and one has to acknowledge that. We do have the backstop of social security systems that have been a feature of New Zealand right from the start. I think it's a factor of having a small population and being very distant. So we do have, all through the pandemic, we've been talking about a team of 5 million, and it's been something that's been deeply felt by every New Zealander, I'm sure. We do feel that we're a team, we're a small country that's isolated from the world, but nevertheless very much part of it, and very much looking to overseas experiences, overseas law, to enhance and to enrich our country, as well, of course, as our dual tradition of, through the Treaty of Waitangi with our Indigenous people, to have that, and all of our immigration and immigrants that we have, to have that team of 5 million, that's a team that's diverse and caring of each other. That, as I say, there are things that are still to be done, but we do have a pride that New Zealand has that feeling.
Thank you. And as we think about going forward and next steps, something that, and whether those next steps are building something from the ground up, as Prime Minister Toure has discussed, or building on a foundation that already is, while maybe not impenetrable, solid enough, like the example of New Zealand, I'd like to pull on something that Yasmin talked about, which is the notion of messaging to make a purpose or a fight more palatable to a broader audience versus sort of being upfront and really demanding, being direct about one's demands. And this is a question that I'd like to, will be the final question of the panel, that I'd like to direct both to Annika and also Professor Rode, given that you have constant contact with nascent attorneys in your capacity as a professor at a law school. And I imagine that my grandmother's rhetoric when she was an advocate, that the laws that she was challenging were misguided efforts to protect women, was honest, but was also strategic. It was a way to win over and placate the all-male panels of judges that she would inevitably encounter. She could not, even if she wanted to, really state outright that these laws were motivated by animus or the idea that women were lesser than, because she couldn't alienate the judges that she would be arguing in front of or insult, those who drafted the laws. And so as we think about how in this, in this moment to fight for women's rights in particular, would you err on the side of caution, messaging to make the purpose more palatable, or would you encourage those you fight alongside or those that you are training to become advocates to be more direct? And how about we go with Professor Rode, and then Annika can have the last word.
That's such a great but complicated question. And I'll try to do justice to it in just a couple sentences. But, I think the real success of path breakers like Ruth Bader Ginsburg was that they knew the time and place for particular arguments. And you cannot, I think, ignore the context and the audience that you're most willing to, and you're most interested in persuading. And there's a time to be making the business case for diversity and to point out the social values and the economic values from inclusion. And there's a time when you really need to call out in a forceful way the practices that are really most oppressive and unacceptable. And even then you pick your forums. Sometimes it's going to be more effective to do it privately, and sometimes you're going to want to do what the engineer at Uber did and put your story out virally. And when she did that and called out the sexual harassment that she'd experienced with on her first day of work, and she had the screenshots to show the both the inappropriate conduct and the human rights personnel's response that, he's a high performer and this isn't a serial offense, which turned out not to be true. And when that went viral, and then she wrote a book about it, that toppled the careers of 20 executives at that company ultimately. And that was without any intervention of law. That was just the power of language. And in the wake of #MeToo, I think we have seen that sometimes that collective consciousness raising that comes from women raising their voice can be really, really important. But I'll close with one more
coffee cup examples since they've been a theme today. I have one that says, well-behaved women never make history. And you know, that's true, but badly behaved women often don't make history either, and they're burned at the stake, metaphorically speaking. So you really need to pick your time and place. Think about the audiences that you most want to reach, the issues that are most important, and how you can enlist a broad constituency in backing you. As your initial question to me pointed out, you know, just getting women's representation is not enough. We've seen, you know, the Republican women in Congress have voted against all the major initiatives that the women's movement has pointed out. We're in such a polarized position, and they really can't afford to buck the party on this. So we have to be realistic in what we expect of people and the context and the constraints in which they're operating.
Can I just add one thing to this, Clara? Like this, I agree wholeheartedly, but there are certain life and death situations where you cannot, and we've experienced that quite a lot, where, you know, in Sudan recently, a young woman was being put to death because she killed her husband in self-defense when he was raping her. There are women in Iran who were going to be executed for being human rights defenders. So there are certain things where it's not, things are urgent and you have to speak out immediately. And I think then there are other things where the context and you want the larger shift in framework and larger shift in consciousness, and that can be, you can be more diplomatic, I think, and more strategic about those. So just wanted to put that out there.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, in following up to Deborah's quite succinct points, it has been an issue of debate, an issue of, you know, weighing as to which, how should we really go about achieving gender equality? I remember after the Beijing Declaration in 1995, the term gender mainstreaming became very popular in government spaces and implementation spaces and in civil society. But we realized that this word or this term was inserted in various documents, but not really actualized, and we didn't have the follow-up. In Kenya, we have really tried to institute not even the 50-50, but the 2/3 gender rule in our legislators and across all, you know, bodies. But we have seen that it has not worked as we envisioned. And despite numerous attempts to have even the lead of majority bring forward a Dwale bill so that it can have, you know, some goodwill, if I may say so, from the rest of the members of parliament. So I say that Justice Ginsburg was able to have a mode of negotiation that she understood, a way of using the agency of the men, the male agency, for the benefit of the women. And I think this is a skill that we aptly need to emulate and see really how to coin it, because even as in today's world, I think mainly, I don't know about the rest of the world, but mainly in an African context, I think Chimamanda spoke to this, that standing out as a feminist is almost being standing out as a terrorist in society. And you find that even on social media, you're attacked when you identify yourself as a person who believes in the empowerment of women and just specifically state that you are a feminist. And I find that we have people who apologize for it and maybe want to apologize for you because maybe they think you will not get married and stay in your home for far too long. But we've seen apologists of maybe sometimes coming from the women constituency who say, no, we are not here to bash men. And we also realize that in achieving gender equity, if we kept on going the way we were going without involving men in this conversation, then we were hitting a wall, because yet to date, we still do not have any country that has been able to achieve gender equity. So we realize that sometimes in these conversations, diplomacy could work, like what I have seen happening with the conversation on FGM, female genital mutilation, where now we are having men as champions of
against FGM, and some of them were able to testify that they did not even know when this occurred to their daughters. So I support the fragility of negotiation, but I also firmly believe that sometimes we need to shake the table to be able to achieve some of the things that we need in gender equity and in the space of women empowerment. Because sometimes asking for these things nicely has never worked. As you have seen, if Me Too did not come out strongly to stand and put our perpetrators to account, then the system of cover up, the system of, oh, he's a very good professional and cannot be a rapist could have gone on. And we also need to accept that in our society, the people who are the perpetrators are also dear to us as brothers and sisters. And so I would go back and say that it is pertinent that we go back to system change and ensure that gender equity is taught from a basic school level to ensure that we do not bring up boys in patriarchy and girls in empowerment in the same household and have these two genders as adults who do not understand each other. Your question, of course, was complicated as Deborah put it, but I hope to have done it justice to the best of my understanding.
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Annika, and to this entire panel, Professor Rowe, Justice Glazebrook, Prime Minister Touré, Annika, and Yasmin. I apologize to UN Women that we ran over by a few minutes, but I hope that is just is demonstrative of the fact that this is just the beginning of a broader conversation that I hope we will all take to our homes, to our places of work, and that it does not end here, and that we will, as Annika said, continue to shake the table. So thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much, Clara. Thank you very, very much. And thank you to all the amazing, amazing speakers for sharing your passion, your commitment, and your knowledge. Thank you so much. And we're going to move into the Q&A, the question and answer session right now. But before we do that, I would like to give the floor to the UN Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict, Pramila Patten, who is here. And Pramila, you can of course speak to whatever you would like to comment on from among what you heard. However, I have a particular question to you that has been raised in the Q&A. So let me start with that question to you, and then you can respond to anything else that you would like to say. So one of the questions that came in on the chat was, do we need to relook at CEDAW at this point in time? Is it serving its purpose, given that even those states that have ratified it with so many reservations? Does it serve its purpose at this moment in time when the entire international human rights framework is so fragile? Over to you, Pramila.
Thank you so much, Lopa. And again, I would like to commend this initiative of UN Women. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to say a few words also as we celebrate the life and enduring legacy of Justice Ginsburg. But first, I'm very pleased with this question. As someone who has had the privilege of serving on the CEDAW committee for 15 years, and having seen the progress over that long a period, I really think that CEDAW is, if not more relevant today than it has ever been. I think we are seeing very dark days. We are living through very dark days, and there may be more ahead. And I think this is the time when we really have to fall back on all regional and international treaties that are legally binding. And that is why, for example, when I took office as the special representative of the Secretary General on sexual violence, the first thing I did was to sign a framework of cooperation with the CEDAW committee, and we are working very closely together. And daily I remind states that they have responsibilities under CEDAW to address, to prevent and respond to conflict-related sexual violence, that CEDAW applies in times of peace and also in times of conflict. So I really encourage everyone to use not only CEDAW, but also its optional protocol with its inquiry procedure and its communications procedure. They are very, very
important tools, which I must admit are not being used adequately. And that has been a problem even in the days when I was on the committee. I wish NGOs, civil society would use these tools more often, because they are invaluable tools. Coming back to the legacy of Justice Ginsburg, I really think that her demise stands out as a particularly dark day in a dark and difficult year. Of course, much has been said about the power of both her work and her personal example. I think we all remember her as a ferocious defender of women and minority rights. She was unfailingly civil and collegial, a consensus builder who admonished us to fight for the things that we care about, but to do it in a way that will lead others to join us. Of course, she was soft-spoken and reserved, and yet her voice has carried to all corners of the globe. She pursued what many considered a revolutionary, radical social change agenda, but did so through a conservative strategy of taking one step, one case, one precedent at a time, to incrementally change the DNA of institutions that are so deeply resistant to change. As she put it, if you're going to change things, you have to be with the people who hold the levers. And she did it so ably, selecting male plaintiffs to illustrate how unequal laws were bad for everyone. I think above all, through her dissents, she helped to make equality a majority opinion in this country. And this is absolutely remarkable, how she put the tools of law to work in the service of justice at a time when the law was shot through with archaic gendered assumptions that kept women subordinate and dependent, at a time when in many states, a husband could not be prosecuted for raping his wife, a woman could be fired for becoming pregnant, pay discrimination was the unquestioned norm, and women were barred from myriad educational and employment opportunities. She opted to liberate women from the law, through the law, by extending the scope of equal protection. I think she famously exposed paternalism, as many has said it, as not a pedestal, but a cage. And she proved that gender-based discrimination was arbitrary, irrational, and unconstitutional at a time when it was as pervasive, as invisible as the air we breathe. And I think we also have to recall, like in her own life, she endured the indignities that she would later work to address. I mean, we all recall how she was accused of occupying a place at Harvard that should rightfully belong to a man, how upon graduating first in her class, not a single law firm in New York City would hire her as a young mother. But still, I think that's the lesson that we have to draw, that she believed in the power of the law as a force for advancing equality. And she understood that the ability of women to participate in the political, economic, and social life of their nation depends on their ability to control their reproductive lives and be treated as full adult citizens responsible for their own choices.
Thank you.
I think at 87 years old, she never lost her appeal. And after decades of making history in the Supreme Court and on the Supreme Court, she viewed her work as unfinished. And I think moving forward, and more importantly, what we and future generations must bear in mind is that the lesson she leaves us is to continue the work, to ensure that the prescribed gender roles will not be obstacles to our children's aspirations, to use the law to achieve substantive equality and social justice, and never stop speaking Ruth to power. Thank you.
Thank you, Pramila. Thank you. And with that, we have a few questions. So I'm going to actually club them together, and we'll start with our younger leaders. So may Amani and Amanda maybe to respond to this. So there was one question that said, Justice Ginsburg spoke to this, but also many of the panelists in this conversation spoke to this, the importance of having mentors. And so To you, Amani, and to Amanda, how important do you think it is to have mentors? And can women achieve their potential without having mentors? And a follow-up question to that is actually, the question is that exceptional women break through discrimination sometimes. But what about average women who are not necessarily worse off, but neither better off than their fellow average men? So how can they have equal chances to succeed or fail? Amani?
Okay, thank you. It's really interesting questions, and a lot of ideas came to my mind while you were reading the questions, Lopa, starting from the importance of having mentors. And it's true, as I mentioned during my intervention, it really started because of my determination and enthusiasm and passion to create change and to help out other women. But also it wouldn't have been possible without having mentors who really gave me the strength and made me believe in myself and made me believe that, yeah, it is possible. And I can change my life, and I can also help out other women and girls also to have the life they want to have and to change their lives for better. So I've been so lucky to be accompanied and mentored by a really amazing women and few men, to be honest, but mostly amazing feminist women who still standing with me and with other girls, who still giving me the knowledge, the support, and the mentorship to make me break through, to help me break through. And of course, that's why now through the Generation Equality campaign and Generation Equality Forum, it's one of the main pillars for this forum and this campaign is to create intergenerational dialogue. And that's why we need to combine the passion and the energy and innovation of young people with also the experience and wisdom and the achievements of the wider generation. And without having this combination, change cannot be achieved, because it's really like the efforts of each group is complementary to achieve the greater impact. So it's really a prerequisite, of course. And when we're talking about what the woman who asked the question about the average woman, and for me, I don't have I don't have the right to classify women if they're average or excellent or good. All women should have opportunities, and it should be given equal opportunities, and should have equal rights and access to justice, regardless of the classifications that the society impose on them. So it's really important also to help out other women to realize their potential. Otherwise, they would believe themselves that to be average, to be unable and incapable of creating the change. Each woman in the world has an internal power and strength that she should unlock, and she should realize and recognize and appreciate this internal power, this passion to change her life and help other women and girls. So it's really important by starting from raising their awareness on their rights and equipping them with the tools and knowledge to be able to demand these rights and change their situation and achieve their demands.
Thank you, Amani. Amanda, quick word from you on that.
Representation, seeing is believing. So, I mean, no one succeeds by themselves, and no one is alone. It's up to us. It takes courage. I want to recognize that, obviously, in many parts of the world, for women, our existence in itself is radical. And courage to me is not the lack of fear, but rather being cognizant of that fear and still marching on. Each activist, and dare I say each woman in existing, represents thousands, hundreds of thousands who have come before us to pave the way for us to take their place in our generation's battle line. You know, and in this sense, we are never alone. And for those of you who feel alone in your fight, I hope you hear the thunderous roar of footsteps before you and the footsteps that are behind you who would one day take your place and have had better lives and liberties because you fought for it to be so. You know, the most powerful tool we have is our voice, you know, and so for the question referencing average, there truly is no such thing as an average woman, again, because your existence in itself is radical. And your joy is the most radical form of rebellion. So keep thriving.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And with those words, we're going to bring this conversation to a close. We are already over time. Thank you very, very, very much to all of the conversationalists in these two conversations. Thank you very much to our two moderators. Thank you to everybody for this amazing conversation on voice, leadership, choice, and not just shaking the table, Annika, but breaking the table and rebuilding it to our aspirations. Thank you very much to everybody. And as we close, we will close with a musical interlude performed by Masha Brodskaya from the Global Creative Initiative. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe, stay well, and bye-bye.
We, Global Creative Initiative, are proud to join UN Women in this event on the International Day of Human Rights, honoring the life and legacy of Justice Ruth Ginsburg. From Global Creative Initiative, we mobilize talented youth to advocate for gender equality and social justice. My name is Masha Brodskaya, and today I'm happy to share with you this little improvisation between violin, piano, and brainwaves. The background music that you're going to hear is getting created in real time by my brainwave impression, using NextVox technology developed by myself and my partner Brian Forbes. Let's see what happens. Hopefully you will enjoy it.